Tana, you think you could pull that up just in case Matt doesn't join us in time? Do you think you could pull it up on your screen? Okay, great. Well, let's get this show on the road. Welcome everybody. Great to see all your faces. Welcome to the November meeting of the Big Hole Watershed Committee. We are very excited about our speakers today and kicking off some work with Beaver and preventing conflict between Beaver and people, and two experts in the field that will be joining us. With that said, one of the things that we decided to do was to shorten the administrative part of the meeting to give them as much time as possible, and hopefully answer as many questions as we can get through. So with that, I'll just sort of introduce just myself. I'm Pedro Marquez, the Executive Director of the Big Hole Watershed Committee. Normally we go through and do a whole round of introductions in person, but I think for expediency's sake, we'll skip that part. I think we can capture everybody who joined for our meeting minutes and attendance list and all that. So Tana, do you want to just quickly do a couple Zoom ground rules to get us started?
Yeah, just a reminder to everybody, if you're not speaking, to please keep yourself on mute so there's not a lot of background noise. And then there's a chat box, so if you do have questions, you can send them to me or Pedro or anybody or the whole group. And just so you know, this will be recorded and we will post it on our YouTube. So fair warning. And that's it.
Okay. So we typically start with a stream gauge with a precip and snowpack stream flow report that Matt Norberg, DNRC hydrologist, usually talks about. I don't see him here on the call yet. So in lieu of that, I think I'll do my best to, I guess I'll have to kind of read through it, but so it's still early, but higher elevations have received some snow and we're off to a good start. Snowpack for the Big Hole based on SNOWTEL is 129% of average, and precip across the watershed we're at 120% of average. Typically this early in the year, it's, yeah, thanks Tana, that's perfect. Little too early to really see anything, but there you see the graph of annual accumulated precip in inches, and we're just starting the water year, creeping up just a little bit above the average line there in green. It is looking like La Nina, we're certainly in La Nina advisory. It's likely to continue through the Northern Hemisphere, looking like 95% chance from January to March, and then into the spring of next year, about 65% chance from March to May. And that was, we were, just to kind of recap, we were sort of at a potential neutral situation, and then in October it really looked like it was going to become a La Nina year. Low average sea surface temperatures were recorded and sort of pushed everything into La Nina, which typically means you know, cooler and wetter for Montana for the winter, which for us in a snowpack driven system bodes well for overall water flows in snowpack. 3-month outlook, November, December, January, equal chances of average temperatures and 40% chance of above precipitation. So typically we would have a moment for questions, and I am not qualified to answer any of those. So I think we'll probably have to skip the question part for the precip report. And we'll just move to the director's report real quick. Thanks, Tana. It's awesome. So I'm going to try to blow through stuff pretty quickly of what's on my desk. As far as the organization's finances, we're looking good to finish the year strongly, wrapping up the projects that we have, getting our annual appeal letters ready to go out, and folks should be seeing those by mid-December. We got our newsletter at the printers, so hopefully we'll be getting those out and on people's dining tables by Thanksgiving, we hope, which is what we always try to aim for. So things are looking good on our end, kind of starting next year with a lot of great new partnerships and opportunities. Next big thing for us on the agenda is this Friday with our drought committee meeting. There was quite a lot of activity on the river this year and a lot of feedback and input back and forth about how the drought management plan was operating. So there will be some good discussion to be had on Friday, really just looking at next year's water year and if our drought management plan will remain as is or if any changes need to be made. Looking forward to that conversation. Main thing on my mind, as always, kind of securing consistent and reliable funding. Some of the key things going on, I'll just sort of glance over them. Our BOR, Bureau of Reclamation, gave us a planning grant for kind of watershed management and planning. So we will be looking at our watershed restoration plan and giving that an update. Our existing watershed restoration plan really highlighted the Mount Hagen uplands area as the #1 priority for us as far as impairments and lots of rivers that had sediment issues and of course related to smelting and mining impacts, sediment, some metals issues. So in that previous plan that was finalized in 2013, we really said that's #1 priority. And we've been going after that area pretty hard over the last 6 years. Millions of dollars of projects have gone in. We feel confident that we have identified and treated most of the major impairment sources. And so it's a great opportunity for us now to revisit this watershed restoration plan and start looking at the rest of the watershed as where are the other areas that really need attention and highlight those in an updated plan, which sets us up for kind of over the next, the next cycle, the next 6-7 years or so, we kind of have a game plan for the issues that we're going to tackle that can most benefit the resources of the river. So that's one part of that planning grant, engaging the lower river stakeholders. So from the notch down to Twin Bridges is, it's an area, and this will be part of our conversation with the drought committee as well. It's an area that we typically have had less engagement with drought management and voluntary conservation measures, and we wanted to bring the same work that we do in the other parts of the river to that section of the river. And at the same time, we're going to be designing a solution for an issue around the Pennington Bridge area where infrastructure is forcing the river into a tight spot, and it's potential hazard for infrastructure and for property. So we've got that contract signed, and I'm working on some subcontracts now, and we'll have those in hand, and we'll see some work going on. Also have a couple proposals out to start dealing with some of those issues. With our Anaconda Superfund work, this was the last year of sort of real heavy construction, and we're going to be transitioning to an operation and maintenance phase. And with that, a potential change in the state's management of that money and sort of who takes the lead on that money, whether it be FWP or if we continue with the natural resource damage program. So there's a big conversation underway between those two entities as to how to do that smoothly. The good thing for us is that the Big Hole Watershed Committee plays prominently in that conversation, and both entities really kind of want to see us at the helm and continuing to coordinate all of that activity and all that work. So we'll keep you posted on that. On the land use planning front, Tan and I engaged the 4 county planners last month, and then we had an updated call with Beaverhead County about some floodplain maps. Basically, the floodplain maps that we already have are up to be adopted by Beaverhead County, and so we'll be working with the county and also with landowners and folks in Beaverhead County, prepping them on what all that means, and kind of having discussions around that. It's something that's been in the works for a long time. It looks like Madison County is just a step behind them in the adoption of those maps. So that is underway, and we look forward to getting those adopted and making sure that everyone is well aware of the implications of that for them. And the last thing that's come up recently, and I'll put that out there, and we have some board members on the call, and this is something that we'll be discussing in more detail. As most of you probably know, during this past election, Montana voters weighed in heavily for conservation through the I-190 bill. That was the recreational marijuana bill. With that bill, it basically legalizes recreational marijuana, and it suggests an allocation of funding that went with it. And that allocation of funding was heavily focused on conservation. How it was written, however, and the legislature and the session that's just about to happen, it is not clear that how that bill was passed is exactly how the funds are going to be allocated for this, for these tax revenues to be distributed. So there's a big opportunity there. And one thing that I have been thinking, and with the work that we're engaged in, wouldn't it be great if groups like ours in conservation districts could see some of the revenue for conservation projects? We always struggle with non-federal matching dollars to put into restoration. This is a potential source of funds that could alleviate that bottleneck. I think that with this session coming up, agricultural interests stand to benefit. And I think that issues that we hear about a lot, as far as wildlife depredation, expenses related to potential brucellosis, and other issues like that, could be things that are attractive to the legislature as far as conservation practices that are worthy of funding. And also, we've been working a lot with the state's stream gauge working group, trying to tackle the problem of inconsistent funding for the stream gauge infrastructure that we all rely on. Last month, I showed some results from our survey that we did, and looking at the USGS's stream gauge website, we see that this summer, upwards of 25,000 unique visits to gauges on the Big Hole. So those gauges are really important. Everybody uses them, whether they're professionals, irrigators, recreationists, guides and outfitters. And some of the things that we recognize is that people aren't aware of the costs of running those gauges. So it's kind of spitballing a bunch of ideas on how best those funds from this new legislation could be allocated in a way that really puts good conservation dollars on the ground. And, you know, I think the Watershed Committee and other groups like us and the conservation districts have demonstrated that we are excellent vehicles for getting conservation dollars on the ground. So I'm interested in pursuing those opportunities as much as possible, and I'll be sort of engaging our board more on other ideas that we may have, and seeing how much we want to dive into legislative session in regards to that. So that's my quick director's update. Happy if anyone has any quick questions, I'm happy to answer them, but otherwise we can move on. All right, I don't think I see any. So steering committee, see Roy and Jim, anything to report? I know we haven't met yet. We're going to meet this next month.
The steering committee, we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, went over a lot of things, and we're anxious to keep things rolling. Pedro's pretty aggressive, keeping our feet to the fire. But we'll represent the group the best we can and get things done, and excited about the next meeting that's coming up.
All right, thank you, Jim. Okay, wildlife report. Tana, you want to give a quick update?
Was muted, sorry. Okay, so this isn't really wildlife, but I did want to mention to everybody to, if you haven't already, to sign up for our e-newsletter at bhwc.org. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And to join us the third Wednesday of each month for our monthly public meetings now on Zoom. Although we won't be having one next month because we take December off. I don't have a whole lot for the wildlife report today. I did want to remind everyone that we have some toolkit items that producers can borrow. We have scare devices, temporary electric fencing, bear spray, resource guides. We also have some bear safety supplies, including bear-resistant backpacking containers, resource guides related to bears, bear spray, and inert practice bear spray. If anyone wants to borrow or test any of that stuff, just get in touch with us. Then the only other thing I wanted to mention was that the Heart of the Rockies initiative received nearly $1 million for wildlife conflict reduction from the NRCS. They have funding. The funding will be spread across 20 groups in 7 states and 2 tribal nations. And the Big Hole Watershed Committee is one of those groups. So we can expect to see some funding over the next, I think, 2 or 3 years for our wildlife programs through that. So that's exciting. And the Range Rider program is done for the season. The compost site is pretty much winterized and just waiting for next year. So that's all I've got for wildlife. Did Jim or Dean or anybody else have anything to add?
I'll just add a little. The Western Land Alliance and Heart of the Rockies and the National Wildlife Research Center of Wildlife Services are getting together and having calls, trying to put together programs. Basically, they're interested in conflict reduction, compensation, all sorts of compensation, including payment for allowing wildlife on your lands. Also, they're looking at control and collaboration. This issue's really come to light. Looks like a lot of time and money and effort's going to be put into it. They have conference calls and are asking for suggestions. I've been involved in a few of those. Tana, have you been involved in any of those calls?
Yeah, I've been on a few of them.
Yeah. So that's going to take quite a lot of our time if we want to get involved. But it'll also a lot to deal with elk migration and having a lot of elk on your land. So that's exciting if one wants to get involved. So there's a opening there if people want to get involved. And I'm sure Tana can line you up with who you need to talk to. Alex Few is the one that's run most of this show. So thank you.
And I forgot to put this on the electronic Zoom agenda, but we had put some time aside for Jim to talk about weather modification legislation that's coming up. So we can remember to do that after the restoration report. Sorry, I think I interrupted somebody. Was there a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask this Dean Peterson. I was going to ask Jim if he got a chance to talk to Cole Mannix.
I did get a chance to talk to Cole, and most of my experience with the elk have been in Idaho. And when I got into a lot of, with those groups down there, I stuck my foot in my mouth and didn't know near as much as I thought I'd know and I knew. And they lined me out pretty well. So I declined to participate in that, but I gave Cole your name.
I know, and I had a conflicting meeting that day, so was not able to do that. But he is going to keep me informed with the minutes of those meetings, and if I can participate, I will.
Yeah, in Montana, we don't have a problem with elk that we can't solve ourselves, and I hesitate to dialogue much when I don't know too much about the problems up here, because you just lead them down a false road.
Sounds good.
Okay, Ben, you want to take a stab at restoration real quick?
Yes. Can you share my screen, Tana?
I made it so you can
Okay.
share it.
Yep.
Sorry
Got
about
it. Got it. All right, guys. Well, good to see everyone. I'm Ben Laporte. I'm the programs manager here at the Big Hole Watershed Committee. Thanks for coming tonight. My entire month since the last time we met has been consumed by grant proposals and future project formulation. That's basically what has been on my desk, and it's kept me busy. And so this meeting, I wanted to quickly give you guys a visual on where these projects are and give you a brief summary of what they are. I made this map here on the left showing the projects that we've done in 2020. Those are shown with a purple star, and the projects that we have our eyes on for 2021, those are in the yellow. And one thing that struck me when I was making this is just how far spread out we are in the watershed with our restoration projects. You know, we're eyeing a lot of projects throughout the whole entire watershed. So I think that's pretty neat. We're certainly moving around and making a lot of progress here. So these projects are in no particular order, but I'll just start from the number one and go down. I'm eyeing Upper Oregon Creek to do restoration work on. That is up here on your upper portion of the map here. It's in the Mount Hagen Wildlife Management Area. It's actually in a new piece of land that FWP acquired recently. And when that land opened up, it gave us a good opportunity to go in there and focus some restoration work in there. What's going on up there is the same exact impairments that are going on across the highway and all the work that we've been doing in the Anaconda uplands with NRDP. You know, smelter emissions, logging, kind of the whole nine. This will be a revegetation sediment catchment project, revegetating 25 acres and catching sediment coming out of about 15 plumes up there. So I applied for DEQ funds for that project. So hopefully you'll be hearing more on that. I also applied for 40 Bar Ranch Bank Stabilization Project, and this project is conjunction with FWP as well. Jarrett Payne, who's actually on the call, has brought this project to our attention and helped us get the proposal in for this. So that is in between Wisdom and Jackson. And that is, we're going to conquer 3 banks to a total of 1,260 feet of bank stabilization. So, you know, we've done this type of project before, going in and, you know, restabilizing these sloughing banks and these severely eroding banks. So getting vegetation reestablished on those as well. So I also applied for funding for the Cinerum. I'm calling it the Cinerum Phase 1 project, and that is down here outside of Twin Bridges at the Pennington Bridge. Pedro mentioned it. It's a pretty dynamic system down there, and the Cinerums are having some really bad issues with their bank eroding. A lot of sediment sloughing off into the river. There's been some riprap above, and there's confinements with roads and bridges, and a lot of human manipulation has gone over here. But we put in funding for what we're calling Phase 1, which is to remove a point bar that's across from the Cinerum bank to relieve bank stress. So this is going to be kind of a temporary fix until we can get in there and do the more highly engineered approach, and take a really keen eye on it. But we thought that we would give it a go to see if we can get in there before next spring and widen that river just a little bit to alleviate some bank stress. That project, we are also going to hopefully plant the existing rip-wrapped bank up there, get some shade on the river. And you know what? I actually found out this week, pretty exciting news, that I got funding for the Upper French Gulch Fish Passage project. It's not set in stone right now, but I'm feeling pretty good about it. It's going to go through the 2021 legislature. And, you know, we have a couple more hoops to jump through before we can get that funding. But that project is again up here on the Mount Hagen Wildlife Management Area. That project will restore upstream passage connectivity to about 1.7 miles of stream above a fish passage barrier right now. And so we've been eyeing this project for quite some time and applied for it last year through the Department of Natural Resources Conservation. And yeah, we're looking like we're in good shape to get that project going here soon. One of the ones that I didn't put on here, it's not numbered here on the left, but it's this moss-up bank planting. This landowner reached out to us outside of Melrose here to do some restoration on his bank, and we figured the best approach is to start to get some vegetation on his bank. You know, that's the first thing that we should do before we get a whole bunch of heavy machinery in there and do a larger scale project. So I applied for funding to go in there for a day. You know, I might call out for volunteers on that one to see if anyone's interested in planting some willow stakes and willow whips. But yeah, that one's going to be a pretty simple revegetation project. Also here on the left-hand side of the screen here, it's an area that we don't do a whole lot of work in right now, not yet, but it's this Bender Creek. We actually got some funding. It's not going to make the whole project, but it's a start. This project's on Bender Creek, which is a headwater tributary to the Big Hole. And basically, to sum it up, the Music Broad fire came through in the early 2000s, 2001. completely nuked to the forest. And there's a really mature beaver complex up there. And the beaver dams actually were a good fire break to this fire. And so when that fire was out of there, it left a bunch of green grass growing in Bender Creek where the beaver dams were. So cattle ended up getting in there, grazing it pretty heavily. And then after that, there was a big spring runoff. So all that combined created a very incised and degraded system up there. And it's about, it is about a mile of the stream is about 7 feet down. And it's completely nuked. So this one, we're working with the Forest Service. They put it on our radar, and we're happy to help out with this project. So hopefully you'll be hearing more about that. And lastly, we're going to continue on with our Anaconda Uplands work, as always. And moving into 2021, we're going to keep working on the Elkhorn Mine and Mill project that is going to just be an ongoing project. But yeah, more to come on these. Just wanted to give you guys a summary, so the next time I talk about them, you're not completely blown away. You guys got any questions for me?
Ben,
Yes,
on
Steve.
the 40 bar bank restoration or bank stabilization, what's your plans, I guess, to stabilize them banks? I've seen that. Some of the section is pretty straight, and then when it hits the corner, it's really rolling that water.
Yeah, actually, since we have Jared on the call, which is nice, Jared, do you mind picking up that answer?
Sure. So I think for kind of the approaches that we'll be taking, Dean, on that section is we will be trying to reduce a little bit of that tight turn in there. Part of the things that we'll probably be doing is we'll probably actually be resloping that bank back pretty far, and then using willows to actually kind of be the upper part of the stabilization part, so we actually get some more of the riparian veg establishing in there, and then putting in willow barbs to actually help deflect flow. And then on the toe of the bank, we'll be using river cobble to kind of hold that in check. It kind of gives that bank to stabilize for the first few years, and then it's still malleable, so we're not stuck with necessarily a permanent curve in that bank. It'll still be able to change and modify as we get point bars forming in there. And yeah, that's kind of the general plan on it. It's kind of a moderate soft restoration technique. We've been using it on some larger sections of the big hole down below on the Christensen Ranch, for example, and it's been working really well. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thanks, Jared.
Yep.
Yeah, and on that one, we're basically, trying to get the funds. Jared's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting and doing the design work on it and working with the landowner. So we're just helping pick up the pieces on that one. So happy to be a part of it. Awesome, guys. We appreciate it.
I'll just chime in too that. Thanks, Ben. This is a great example for us. Just appreciate that that Jim McGee, Fish and Wildlife Service, and that Jarrett kind of reached out to us for many years. The committee was involved with CCAA projects. This ranch is not an enrolled ranch, and we sort of felt like they had this area kind of taken care of, and the partnership program was always dealing with everything up there. But now with the capacity that we have in hands, I think looking forward to kind of deepening the partnership that we have with these two entities, and helping bring more resources to help them achieve all of their goals that they're looking forward to up in restoring Arctic grayling, getting more stream shading, more vegetation, increasing those vegetation scores on all those miles of river up there. and it's been going well so far, so we're just trying to give it a little boost. Okay, with that, thanks, Ben, for restoration report. And I think unless there's, are there any other items of business or other topics that folks want to bring up? We've got a little window here to bring those up, and then otherwise we'll move on to our educational piece.
We want to talk about the weather modification legislation real quick.
I sure could. This is Jim Hagenbarth. I'm trying to get some weather modification, which is cloud seeding. And generally in our area, that would be cold weather cloud seeding for snowpack. We got a study bill out of the last legislature. The Water Intern Policy Committee put out a study on it and recommended some legislation. The vote was 8-2 in favor of it. And Senator Gillespie out west of Shelby is going to carry that legislation. There's quite a lot of interest. Stock growers are supporting it. For 2 years in a row, the Eastern faction in the Farm Bureau, who are very conservative, refused to support it. I think it's important. I would like to get the Big Hole Watershed Committee and the Beaver Watershed Committee on board. And Tan, I think the best way to do that is just set up a webinar, and I can do a PowerPoint on it. And it's unbelievably important. We can increase our snowpack from 8 to 15%, and we might be able to do it without much infrastructure if we can lease the snow Idaho Power's equipment in Idaho to seed those clouds, which are moving into Montana. But it's I'm not going to take any more of your time. Tana and Pedro and I will work it out, and we can just have a webinar. And if you're interested, you can just get on the webinar if that's possible. And I am not going to ask the Big Hole Watershed Committee support until they've looked at the webinar and made an educated decision. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
That sounds great, and I'll follow up with you on some dates to set for the webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jim. Okay, any other additional items of business? Okay, if not, I'm really excited to bring on Alyssa Chott from the Clark Fork Coalition and Sarah Bates from National Wildlife Federation, who are going to talk about beaver on the landscape, human and beaver interactions, and conflict prevention programs that they are heavily involved with here in the state of Montana. With that, I will kind of turn it over to you two.
Well, thanks, Pedro. This is Sarah. Tana, can you enable me to share my screen?
I think you should be able to.
Okay, great.
Ready?
Wasn't sure. I heard that you had to give permission before. Can you see that? Let's see. There we go. Well, seeing that. Great. Well, thank you. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes and then turn it over to Alyssa, because she really is the expert between the two of us on this program, and she has more to say. But I'm starting partly to say thank you to the Big Hole Watershed Committee for being great partners, for being a great role model of a watershed-based organization, for being a resource to others outside of the watershed, and just be great colleagues. I've really enjoyed being able to work with all of you on the staff, and to be able to visit some of your projects has been really inspirational for me. I work in the Missoula office. It's a regional office of the National Wildlife Federation. We're a national organization, but our regional work and our state-based affiliates are really the foundation of what we do and how we work. So here in Montana, we, a few years ago, started working with partners to explore opportunities for restoring beaver on the landscape and restoring landscapes working with beavers. And we discovered, of course, very quickly, you don't do that without working with a lot of other people. What I'd like to do is just quickly give a little background about how we came to work with the Clark Fork Coalition and other partners on this project. And there we go. Just to be on the same page as we get started, you know, just the idea of working with beavers is to help improve the natural water storage on the landscape. And the Big Hole Watershed Committee does this regularly, so it's not news to any of you. But when we have more beavers, when we restore beavers to some of their historic areas, we end up reconnecting the floodplain, helping to charge the groundwater, mitigating for drought and lost snowpack or changing snowpack, increasing habitat connectivity for many other species, and in short, improving our restoration outcomes. And when we talk about beaver restoration, that means a lot of different things. And I just want to clarify that, because we're not always just talking about the animal. We're not always talking about picking up beavers from one place and putting them in another. And as a matter of fact, that's very rarely done in Montana. That is a fairly common practice in some other Western states, where you might have beavers that are being a nuisance in one place, and they can be live trapped and moved and put into a place where there's a targeted restoration plan. We've done very little of that in Montana. We might have more in the future, but it's not really the first strategy here. In some cases, when we restore streams that have historically had beavers, that invites the beavers back, makes it possible for them to come and naturally recolonize. In other cases, as you well know, and you're actively involved in it here in this watershed, we're mimicking beavers. We're building structures that help restore ecological processes by getting in the way of the water. And in some cases, that also invites the beavers back in to live in the watershed. And as I'll talk about in a minute, and you're going to hear more about, part of beaver restoration is building tolerance for beavers, and that means addressing the fact that they can create problems and nuisances. There's a lot of interest in restoring beavers in Montana, to the point where we have an active statewide beaver working group that the National Wildlife Federation a couple of years ago became the coordinator of. This originally was part of the Montana Wetlands Council, and it is a very diverse group of people: agency folks, landowners, trappers, sportsmen, a wide variety of people who have an interest in the role of beavers in riparian and watershed health. And we do get together periodically to share information, to share resources, to figure out what our priorities are going forward, and especially to explore opportunities for partnership. Most recently, we gathered this last February in Butte. We had 50 people together, and we spent time, as you can see from this photo of the whiteboard with the sticky notes, we shared stories about who's doing what with beaver habitat around Montana. We got out in the field and looked at some beaver habitat, and we spent a good bit of time talking about where do we need to go and how can we work together? What are our strategic priorities? This is a very summary list of our strategic priorities, and I'd be happy to share the full write-up with anybody. It's readily available. But we would like to work toward broader habitat restoration for beavers, going beyond isolated projects as we're now seeing them, and seeing it as a more regular strategy in stream and watershed restoration all around the state. We especially are focused on expanding the presence of beavers in public lands headwaters, where they can exist with perhaps the fewest conflicts. And to get there, we need to provide outreach, education, and work with people directly to share information about the benefits of beavers and the opportunities to address problems that might come up. And in some cases, we have to deal with policy or legal issues. So we're doing some work on that. Some of that has to do with permitting for beaver habitat projects, and some of it has to do with management policies. So in this work and through all of these conversations, primarily through this really diverse Beaver working group, we've identified different categories of issues that represent real concerns that people have or information needs that we need to address. And this really represents what we're working on, what the coalition of conservationists and agency partners and others are working on to try to achieve beaver restoration. As I've mentioned, social acceptance, the idea of working with landowners or others who are encountering problems with beavers, issues around permitting and the regulation of doing work in a watershed to imitate beavers or bring them back. Just getting more information on flows that result when you have beaver habitat restoration. What happens to water quality? What happens to fisheries? Are the impacts generally positive, negative, or do we need to know more about them? There's some very active research underway to try to answer those questions. And of course, what are the impacts for other species when you expand beaver presence or the function of beaver on the habitat? So that's a very quick run through sort of the hot issues of right now around beavers in Montana. There's a lot of people interested. Whenever we have a get together or a conversation, we end up drawing a lot of folks. Beavers are interesting right now and they're important. And what I'd like to do is introduce Alyssa Chott, because Alyssa is the result of all of this collaborative work. We, the National Wildlife Federation, joined together with two other groups, with the Clark Fork Coalition and Defenders of Wildlife. In close cooperation with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, we created a new pilot project to try to figure out what we can do to address nuisance factors of beavers, a beaver conflict mitigation project. And we were able to bring together enough money for the first couple of years to get started. And we hired Alyssa as our shared seasonal worker, Beaver Tech. And Alyssa has done just a really fine job of getting this off the ground. And with no further ado, what I'd like to do is just turn it straight over to Alyssa to take it and tell you about the project. Let me get myself not sharing anymore.
Thanks, Sarah.
There we go.
All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you guys can all see my presentation. All right, is that coming up for everyone? Perfect. Okay, so my name's Alyssa Chott, and I'm housed with the Clark Fork Coalition, but I do work very closely with Sarah with National Wildlife Federation and Aaron Hall with Defenders of Wildlife. And this project I came on last spring, but this was years worth of work leading up to my position coming in. So I'm very thankful for Sarah and all of her hard work with that. My background's actually in bear conservation and bear-human conflict mitigation. So now I'm working my way through the beaver world and beaver-human conflict mitigation. So why start a pilot project? Sarah mentioned a lot of the restoration goals that they had and why it's important to have beavers on the landscape, but then it was recognized that conflicts with beavers are sometimes a barrier to those restoration goals. And so addressing conflicts with a variety of stakeholders, whether they're roads crews or different watershed organizations, park management on various public lands, whether it's BLM or FWP. And so developing this pilot project to address those concerns and find solutions is how we're going to raise those levels of tolerance for beavers on the landscape. And our goals are to, number one, build more tolerance and understanding. What do beavers do that benefit us in our everyday lives? And whether you're an irrigator needing water storage later in the season or needing contaminant filtration up in headwaters, beavers are really great. So we're trying to reduce beaver conflicts via non-lethal methods so we can leave beavers in place and they won't cause damage. And also part of that comes to helping our partners reduce beaver-related conflicts and training them on these methods as well. So Sarah went over a few of the beaver benefits, but why would we want beavers on the landscape, and why are we asking people to tolerate them? Increased water retention and base flows, decreased peak flows, expansion of habitat area and complexity. This little salamander friend down here, I found this summer, but 80% of Montana's wildlife species depend on beaver-created wetlands at some point during their life cycle. And so beaver wetlands are really critical for a wide variety of species. Sediment retention, nutrient cycling, contaminant filtration, and increased groundwater recharge. So now that we know why beavers are so great, let's get into some of the headaches they cause. So conflict types, there are 3 main categories that I deal with, and that's tree cutting. I'll go back to that for a second. So tree cutting, sometimes they go after really large cottonwoods, and some people see that as wasteful because they're cutting down these massive trees that they can't even move. However, they're trying to get to the tops of the trees, so where they have those leafy greens up top to eat the leaves during the summer. They can use the branches and eat the bark, use that for building material and to build their caches. And then those trees, as they fall into streams, also create little microhabitats as well for, say, young fish. And so it's not wasteful. They're trying to get to the top of the trees, and then them cutting down trees also creates habitat for other critters as well. But however, if they're cutting trees in your backyard, they can cause infrastructure damage, and that's not a great thing. So culvert plugging is the most common issue that pops up that I hear about from different landowners and stakeholders. This is a culvert plugged out in Council Grove State Park outside of Missoula that we did a project on earlier this summer. And this was pre-installation. I have a picture later on that I'll share post-installation. And then freestanding dams, this pair of beavers got really busy and flooded out a phone box and a horse pasture and this guy's yard, as well as a water well. So they can cause a lot of damage with freestanding dams. And so how do we address those conflicts and get people to have beavers in place without the damage? So with tree cutting, it's fairly straightforward and easy, just sturdy mesh fencing wrapped around it. I never use chicken wire just because it has to be placed against the trunk of the tree, and then that risks girdling the tree as it grows and makes it tighter if people don't check it as often as they should. So I just prefer this sturdy mesh fencing. It stands up on its own. You can wrap it large enough so that the tree has room to grow. And then culvert plugging, the most common complaint, you can put a fence around it. And so this I generally use 6 by 8 inch mesh, just cattle panels, sturdy cattle panels. So this fence is placed far enough out upstream so that the beavers are kept away from the flow and that pool of water as it flows into the culvert inlet there. And those are 2 of the stimuli that key beaver into plugging a culvert, because to a beaver, a culvert is an otherwise, it's a hole in an otherwise perfectly good dam. And so they, relatively little work, they can plug it up and hold back a large amount of water. All culvert fences need a floor. It's not shown in the drawing, but otherwise the beavers are going to tunnel under and access the culvert inlet. And then for freestanding dams, we use what is known as a pond leveler. And so these are pipes that are placed through the dam to create a leak. And you can sneak water away from beavers, generally up to a vertical foot of water. And so you notch the dam and then place the pipe through it. The intake is at least 15 feet upstream so that they don't associate the drop in water with the new thing in the pond. But the intake, again, is caged so that it keeps them out away from the pipe inlet so they don't feel that pull of water into the pipe and key into damming that. But the pipes are sized to handle base flows. It's anywhere from, we used an 8-inch pipe on a project last year, all the way up to 18-inch pipes, depending on the watershed size. But just sturdy HDPE pipe. And then you send the outlet down on the other side of the dam, and they're used to hearing water trickle on that side of the dam, so they don't try and mess with that. And so this project started last year, and our first set of activities was, where are the conflicts occurring? And so those 3, tree wrapping, culvert plugging, and freestanding dams, I called around to a bunch of different agencies and organizations trying to find out which landowners were having issues. And we identified demonstration sites, so where we could put in and install these structures to help lower water levels or keep beavers from plugging culverts. And part of this project is to develop a cost share program to incentivize participation for landowners, because traditionally, up until recently, it's been just trapping has been the way to deal with nuisance beavers, and that's cheaper up front than these devices. But in the long run, because it's only temporary, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And so if there's really great beaver habitat that they're trapped out of, there's just going to be more beavers that disperse in the spring or later in the summer that find that habitat and set up shop again. So it's a temporary fix. And so yes, upfront costs of trapping are less than these devices, but long-term, these devices can last 7, 10, 12 years in a watershed. And so long-term solutions are better for watersheds and for financial reasons as well. But this cost share program that we have set up is designed to help landowners buy materials. My position is funded by grants, and so it's just material costs that we're asking landowners to help out with as of now. And so we can help them purchase materials. And then we also want to educate and train our partners. That's one of our main goals as well. And so we continued with those activities for this season as well, identifying conflict areas, installing demonstration projects, and working with partners. And then maintaining our structures from last year, finding out how these structures work in our thick Montana ice, etc. Those are all things that we're trying to figure out as the years are going to go on with these projects and we have these structures in place. And then continue outreach and trainings with our partners and stakeholders. So this is our 2019 conflict area map. And so we had several projects sprinkled around an Anaconda area and Missoula. This project up here actually didn't go through, but the conflict zone or the conflict areas are with these black stars around. And so that was 2019. And this is this year. We have a lot more spots on the map. 27 reported conflicts this year and 6 projects. So that's 13 more reported conflicts than our first year, which is really great. We've had kind of word of mouth spread between fish biologists and wildlife biologists with FWP. And then, of course, working with Big Hole Watershed Committee, we were able to work with a lot of really great partners on 2 different projects down in your area this year. So here are some quick projects I'm going to run through that we installed. This is a combination of last year and this year's projects, but tree wrapping at the Rock Creek Confluence in Clinton. Last year we wrapped trees at the Country Club Golf Course in Opportunity. They were tired of having to pick up trees off of the golf course and pay somebody to come and cut them and haul them away. Washoe Park in Anaconda, we rewrapped a bunch of the trees because those were done with chicken wire and were starting to become too tight on a lot of their trees. Sharon Fishing Access outside of Missoula, Kelly Island Fishing Access Site in Missoula, and then Perkins Gulch on the east side of Deer Lodge Valley was at the request of some ranchers who had beavers move back into this area, a little reach of stream on this plot of land that they leased from DNRC, and it was just aspen. There wasn't any other browse, and so they were worried the beavers were going to take out the entire grove. And so we wrapped a variety of different ages and sizes of trees so that natural selection could continue and the beavers would have some browse, but it wouldn't devastate the entire aspen grove. And so here we get into culvert exclusion fences. This is our Council Grove State Park, the blocked up culvert that I showed earlier. That's actually a 7-foot culvert. And over here in this little nook, that's a 3-foot culvert. And so we put a massive 22 foot long and 10-foot wide exclusion fence on it. And we partnered with FWP and AmeriCorps. And so this design actually has a little wildlife passage around there. So this mesh is 6-inch by 8-inch, and muskrats and otters can just fly through that no problem. But beavers, we don't want these fences to be a block if they're trying to move upstream or downstream. So we make little wildlife passages so that they have a way up and around, and that discourages them. It's very narrow, and they aren't likely to take sticks in there with them and make that bend up and around the 3-foot culvert there. And beavers also just don't like to take sticks and material from the water up onto land and then back into the water. And so we can use their natural little quirks and biological processes like that to kind of get ahead of them and outsmart them as far as keeping them from taking material in there and blocking culverts, but still allow passage. So California Creek, this was a project that Ben and Tana were part of in the beginning of October. And so this was an area where the road was washing out right over here. And this had a vertical culvert piece on it that was intended to keep the beavers from plugging the culvert. And it worked. However, it was blocking a lot of the flow. So we took that off and put in this culvert fence instead, so that the culvert capacity would be increased and the road wouldn't wash out as water got higher. And this over here on the right, culvert fences don't always have to be huge and big. This was a little tiny pond, and so we made a little tiny culvert fence, and knowing that the beavers were going to come and dam along it, because that picture that I showed, the diagram that and I explained how culvert fences are big enough so where it keeps the beavers out away from that feel and pull of water into the culvert inlet. This wasn't going to have it at Lost Creek. There wasn't enough space for that. And so we put a pipe through there preemptively. We combined a pond leveler and a culvert fence to make this. And so they came and dammed along that, but then the pipe carries the water through the beaver dam, and then the beaver can't completely plug the culvert, and the water carries the pipe capacity. And Ben, I stole your picture. So this is another project that we worked with Big Hole Watershed Committee on this summer. And this is at Sugarloaf Lodge. And so this is an active, or was an active beaver complex in the spring. And then this was an old structure here at the mouth of the culvert that was made of really flimsy material, and so it kind of collapsed in as the beavers, since they weren't maintaining the dams after a while, that started to degrade and then collapse the flimsy structure. So we went in and put in this sturdy fence with the floor so that they can't tunnel under to protect the culvert from blocking it. And we worked with Anaconda Deer Lodge Valley Roads crew on this, and they've had to come in with a jet on the other side of this culvert because the beavers have just completely plugged it up and the water has been 12 feet deep at this site. And so this is a really important site to keep the beavers from blocking the culvert, because otherwise it's really expensive to bring in heavy machinery to fix the problem. And this is a head gate. So culvert fences can actually be put onto head gates as well, and irrigation ditches to keep beavers from plugging it. So these two giant piles on either side are what the irrigators have had to remove over the past 3 or 4 years that the beavers have been damming here. This is the dammed head gate, and that's what it looked like the day we went to install it. And so we removed the material and then put in this fence to keep beavers from blocking up that area again. And so far it has worked, and they have not been able, it's saved the irrigators some time and headaches with having to come in and clear out additional debris that the beavers have dragged in there. So culvert fences also work on head gates. This is a pond leveler that we put in at Lost Creek State Park. Again, it's the pipe that is notched through the dam, and then you have the intake that's caged. It was a freestanding dam next to a road that was causing some roadbed saturation issues and some worries for park maintenance. And so we went and installed the intake fence out there in the ponds, and there's the pipe as it goes up and over through the dam. I think, Sarah, this is your picture, and so Sarah was standing on the dam taking a picture of us in the water. And so these structures, they're fairly simple techniques, and the materials used are readily available at Lowe's or Home Depot, but it's really important to have proper design and sturdy materials. And so each design is site specific. None of those culvert fences that I showed pictures of were the same size or shape. And so designs have to be created for each site and just made specific, and that kind of goes into the permitting process as well. You have to draw up diagrams with your 310 or your 124, but I'll get into that in just a minute. So our project helps with site assessment, device design, and again, sturdy materials are a must, otherwise they'll collapse, or they're not going to hold up in ice, or they're not going to last that 7 to 10 year window that we hope these devices can last in these watersheds here. We also help with permitting, installation, and then cost share funds as well. And so your permits are either a 310 for private land or a 124 if it's on public land, or if it's sponsored by a public entity like FWP. That Council Grove culvert fence was technically on private land, but FWP, it was to protect their roadway, so they paid for it. And so that was a 124 that we ended up doing for that project. The exceptions are irrigation ditches. No permits are needed. So that head gate we did on Alvey Beck, we didn't need a permit for that one. Maintenance on these structures is fairly simple. Just need to make sure that there's no buildup on culvert fences unless it's the culvert fence with the pipe through it. They're supposed to dam on that fence. But generally, standalone culvert fences, you need to clean off material and make sure it's functioning. And that is 3 to 4 times a year and takes 10 to 20 minutes each visit. So that really saves time and money for like roads crews that otherwise would have to go out and unplug culverts every other day and spend a lot of time. And when they have a giant list of other duties that they need to get done in the summer season. So training partner organizations. I was super excited when Ben Laporte got in touch with me earlier in the season, and we were able to kind of kick off this partnership and do some trainings. And I'm excited to see what the committee can do going forward as well, but collaboration is key. I'm just one person. I can't be spread out all over the watersheds, and so being able to train different organizations and different people to just use these, whether it's to in restoration sites where it gets ahead of where beavers are likely to move into, or where beavers have caused problems or are active, just making sure that problems can either be solved or kind of taken care of proactively. And so our partners have been just really, really great to work with. We've worked with game wardens and biologists and park managers from FWP, Big Hole Watershed Committee, Blackfoot Challenge, Five Valleys Land Trust, Montana Rail Link. You'll see a lot of roads crews at the bottom of that list, and that's because culverts are beavers, a very easy target for beavers. And so to kind of just quickly summarize, conflict resolution resources are needed for restoration success, and solutions are site specific. Make sure the design fits the site and make sure materials are sturdy enough to withstand spring runoff and ice buildup throughout the winter. Working with landowners to build tolerance and understanding. My first question for landowners is always, what do you need to have beavers here? Or, you know, some people don't want to live with beavers. Most people are willing to live with beavers as long as they're not causing issues. Cost sharing also helps just people have a financial way to live with beavers, because we don't want the cost of a device to be a prohibiting factor in people wanting to live with beavers. And so cost share is really important in this sorts of work. And then ultimately coexistence to promote healthy watersheds, because of all those great benefits that beavers can offer, is just going to be really important as we move forward in a future with climate change and drought. And we're going to need water storage in our headwaters and later flows and these high water events in other areas to kind of reduce the impacts of those. And so beavers are really, really important for healthy watersheds. And so before we get into questions in the discussion, I just want to thank Big Hole Watershed Committee one more time for letting Sarah and I come and talk, and for your partnership over the summer and moving forward too. I hope to continue to work together. So thank you. And should I leave this up for a minute? Or can we come back to that? I don't know.
Yeah, feel free to leave it up, I think.
Okay.
Unless you have another slide, but if that's the final
No,
slide.
that's it.
Yeah, let's leave that one up there. Awesome. Thank you. It was so great. I'm so glad we finally got to work with you guys. We've been sort of doing all the beaver mimicry stuff for a long time, and then finally now we're getting into the conflict program. So open it up for questions, folks. I know that depending on where we are in the Big Hole watershed, the conflicts are of a different nature. I know in the lower river, we've got the constant cottonwoods dropping into the river and landowners constantly pulling them out to avoid future problems. And maybe in the upper river, it's more of the plugging and damming. Any thoughts from some of our irrigators or anybody else? Anybody out there have current problems with beaver, or are we all coexisting just fine? I have to start calling on people by name.
If any of the students have questions, you're welcome to speak up now too.
I also thought it might be interesting if Alyssa talked about how she gained her expertise besides all her hands-on experience in the last 2 years. She went through a pretty special training program that she might want to describe.
Sure. So it's called Beaver Corps, and Mike Callahan, who's based in Massachusetts, has kind of headed that and started a nonprofit to help kind of train the trainers like we're trying to do here in Montana. But he has been doing this since 1998, I believe, and he's installed over 1,700 structures, and he's helped develop his own designs on culvert fences and the pond levelers, and he's offered this mentorship and training. There's an online portion where you go through and kind of get the basics on, he's kind of pitched it as starting your own business, but it's also really valuable just to find out about how to do site assessments and make good recommendations for landowners and develop good designs for each site, because again, it's very site specific, especially for culvert fences. And so he's developed this 2-part course for it. And so part of it's online and the kind of paperwork book part of it. And then the other part is where you actually go out and find sites, and he helps you choose what to do. It's all remote, but you send him pictures and your thoughts on what should happen at each site, and he walks you through it and gives you advice. And he's just really great and helpful for any questions I have, and the rest of the Beaver Core group too. So.
Alyssa and Sarah, this is Jim Hagenbarth. We have a ranch in Idaho on the south side of the Centennials. When I was young, I'll say 60 years ago, there were beaver everywhere. And now there's hardly any. It was great habitat, but they'll eat themselves out of the habitat. There's been a problem in that in all the timber prescriptions, you have a pretty big buffer on these small streams in the conifer habitat, and the conifers have moved down into the stream, has moved out the deciduous trees and the aspen, and kind of taken the habitat away from the beavers, so they got to leave. I think it's important to when you have a timber sale, quite often there's an attempt to stop the timber sale. And one of the ways they do it is make the prescription so hard that the loggers can't handle it. But I think it's important that you folks start promoting getting those conifers. There's a buffer along these small streams, not to even touch them because of sediment. Yet the conifers in those small streams are taking away all the deciduous trees and actually drying up the stream, or taking a lot of water. And I think it's important when you're dealing with beaver that you address that situation if you want those beaver to move back up into the higher areas. Another issue is this is a predator-rich environment, bobcats, lions, wolves, coyotes, maybe a bald eagle. I think those beaver are subjected to quite a lot of predation, especially high in the mountains, that they didn't used to have when predators were controlled a lot more. And another, there has to be some cumulative effects to lose the numbers of beaver that we lost in the last 50 years. In the last 20 years, there's hardly been any trapping, so most of it's been natural or loss of habitat or disease. And so I think it's important that you folks, or all of us, work on why the beaver aren't up there and start addressing those situations. We used to trap beaver and then pack them up high to create water places for the sheep. But over the years, they've left or eaten themselves out of house and hold and have moved down. And so, there's a lot of things. It's great to have those beaver up high. It's great to use them where you're using your beaver mimicry. You don't have to pay work comp. You don't have to get people up. You don't have to worry about them being there. No health insurance, nothing. They just do it. And it's like biological control with noxious weeds. So they're a huge asset in the right places. And generally you can work with them. So I would encourage you folks to understand or try to understand what's happened to the beaver populations in the uplands.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that, Jim. Thank you for just highlighting how complex the issues are. And I think we're trying not to be simplistic in any of our work here. It is really complicated. And clearly one of the big questions is, where is the suitable habitat? What condition is it in? And what can we do to make sure that we're not setting up beavers or people for failure? So, you know, the Forest Service, for its part, is really quite interested in participating and is writing these goals into their forest management plans increasingly as they're doing new plans right now. And I think the fact that there are new models and tools for assessing suitability of beaver habitat that are being rolled out and adapted for use in Montana will just help with making that kind of determination. But everything you mentioned is insightful and very useful. And I think if we come across as being simplistic beaver believers, then we haven't done very good at communicating our position, because I don't think we see it as simple in any way.
Yeah, our East Fork Divide Creek project, I think, is a perfect example where it was brought to our attention as a site on the Forest Service in the Highland Mountains, where actually a local, local person from Butte that came to us, and they asked us about beaver mimicry. Hey, have you heard of this beaver mimicry thing? And I kind of chuckled. I was like, yeah, I think I've heard about it. But he said that he used to ride horses up to this area, and it used to be just ponded with active beaver dams. And I do, in my assessment, forest management activities up in those mountains and fire suppression have really allowed the conifers to come in to the point where when we got in there, the conifers were growing right in the valley bottom. And you can see that the old aspen colonies that were there are going away. And just to add more complexity to that, you know, it's aspen are a successional, they're in a stage of succession. And so they establish in an area for a time, and then they do get shaded out at a point. But our work was exactly to try to reestablish that kind of wetted habitat, because it did look like the beaver pretty much had just eaten themselves out of anything that was available for food and forage. And I think there's a lot of, I'm guessing that there are a lot of sites like that. There used to be robust aspen colonies all up into a watershed, and they're since, they're degrading. The conifers are kind of creeping in, and that trajectory doesn't bode well, I think, for water availability overall. So it's kind of complex and ongoing, and there's an aspect of how intense do we get in trying to restore, and to what point do we try to restore them to. Yeah, curious to hear folks that work the land and are need that water and irrigate and deal with beaver, what your perspectives are as well.
I'll say one of the things that stood out to me doing these two projects was that everyone certainly does have an opinion on beaver, and how you go about, changing their mind or talking to them and breaching that subject is different from, project to project and individual to individual. And my experience was the culverts that we put in, we certainly weren't trying to change everyone's perspective in one way or the other. It was just kind of sharing the knowledge that we had, and explaining to folks the benefits that they do have and the benefits that these devices do have. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting that folks are very opinionated about this subject, and varies from person to person. I'm sure Elissa runs into those kind of conversations all the time. And we talked about it, but I also just wanted to mention that the two projects that we did would not have happened without Elissa. She was the first person I called, actually. I found out about her position and gave her a shout. And man, she basically walked me and Tana through both of these projects. And so big kudos to you, Elissa. Appreciate it. And it was a really good training opportunity for me and Tana as well to do more projects like this in the future. So yeah, appreciate it to you and to Sarah as well.
Yeah, big thank you to you, Ben. You did a lot of the legwork and negotiating as well. And I do want to get you out on that pond leveler this next season too for more training.
Yeah, we had the opportunity. We're potentially going to throw a pond leveler into one of the sites, that California Creek site, but decided not to for a multitude of different factors. But yeah, that's the one thing that I am interested in checking out. It seems a little bit more intense than the culvert fences. So yeah, keep me up to date.
I will.
You're being kind of smug, Dean.
Come on, Dean, what do you got for us?
I recently had a beaver problem, but I solved it. And Pedro knows about it because I missed the last watershed meeting because I had a backhoe stuck in a beaver pond. So, but the problem's solved. Wasn't necessarily non-lethal though.
Very cool.
Having dealt with your problem, would any of these other solutions have been viable? Because maybe I guess what I'm getting at is maybe these solutions are good in certain parts, maybe headwaters of our watersheds, but when we're on sort of active working ranch lands in the valley bottom, maybe it's just kind of a no-go. I'm just curious.
You know, I thought about several of their solutions. The fencing, they were plugging a head gate and then deterring water out in a ditch that I didn't need to run there all winter. The fencing, it would have been very difficult to do. The key is habitat. And so if in my situation, there's lots of habitat and there's numerous dams in the area. I just didn't want a couple dams in head gates in which I just removed the dams out of the head gates. But yeah, I think you're right, Pedro. There's situations where you can fix it and other situations where not. And the gals were right. The beaver, it's a vacuum. There'll be more beaver back in time. And then next time around, I'll consider some of their methods too.
Well, I think that's a great point because these devices aren't for every site. And I personally have had to recommend trapping because landowner goals haven't met up with what the beavers needed or what the habitat could provide. And so those are, when I'm assessing a site, those are the three categories that I look at: what the landowner's goals are and what they need, what the beavers need to survive, and then what the devices can actually do. And if those three match up, then great, we can do a project. Otherwise, trapping might be the answer. And I think trapping is always going to be needed because there's going to be places where beavers just aren't appropriate, because we're talking about beaver restoration and the habitat benefits they can bring. If they're setting up shop in an irrigation ditch, that's not going to be great habitat. I mean, what the benefits that they provide in a hayfield aren't going to be what we need or want, or what the irrigator needs or wants, and what the ranchers need. So I think trapping is always going to be a definite management tool to have as well. But these are also great in areas like California Creek, where there's just open habitat. And yes, there's a road running through there, but we can fix that. And then the beavers can have the rest of that landscape there. And so, yeah, picking and choosing how and when to live with beavers and what the habitat benefits are going to be are definitely part of what goes into our site assessments as well. And Sarah, did you want to add to that?
I think you did a great job, Alyssa, answering it, and it's a good example, but it's also an illustration that this is not a project that is all about animal rights and anti-trapping. I think when you get into non-lethal control, it's easy to misread what it is we're about. And we're about restoring function and helping to promote expansion of beavers in appropriate places, not to save every beaver everywhere. And I think that's just a good thing to note, and it needs to be part of our communications. And the other side of that is, you know, I have been doing outreach and partnering with trappers in Montana who are active in the Montana Trappers Association. And, you know, some of them make a living as nuisance trappers, and they're called in when there's a problem. There's some benefit for some of them to get some training in these techniques and perhaps broaden what they could be paid to do. And in some cases, they're paid to take beavers out. And in other cases, they might be paid to help put in appropriate devices to help reduce the problem. You know, kind of a more comprehensive damage mitigation approach. So, you know, I think there is no one answer for everywhere, and we're not trying to be simplistic about this. And Alyssa, you already addressed that really nicely.
I'll just kind of add, is for sort of informational purposes, from my understanding, the one way that the Forest Service is getting at trying to doing is by aspen exclusion, categorical, exclusion. So there's sort of, if you're going to be trying to restore aspen, that's a way on the forest to get these projects in. And so I guess from a regulatory standpoint, the agencies are all looking at different things. BLM has a pretty robust sort of statewide categorical exclusion to do this type of work. So they're looking at it on their properties. And Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, for their part, and this was part of our discussion in February, there's currently, to my knowledge, there's really not an easy avenue to actually move beaver from one location to another. And so we're kind of left with a trapping with a lethal scenario there. But that's also something that I think, you know, Sarah's coordination is working on addressing. It gets pretty complicated from a regulatory standpoint. So hopefully this discussion provokes some questions, ideas, and gets, you know, our stakeholder base knowing that there are options out there. And when you do see or hear about a beaver issue or a neighbor that's like, God damn it, the beavers again, you know, instead of just, you know, blow up the dam, there's some other ways. And we're all ears, and Ben and Tana are now kind of becoming experts on this stuff too. And we've got support to come up with other alternatives. Any further questions? This is awesome. I'm glad we got some engagement going on this issue, because this is kind of the crux of the work that you two are doing, Sarah and Alyssa. And it's important work, and finding the right threading the needle the right way is part of the path forward.
Well, thanks, Pedro. I mean, it's part of a bigger effort. And if anybody wants to learn more about what's going on around the state, I'd be happy to add you to the mailing list for the Beaver Working Group. It's just an open network of people who are interested, and I send out a newsletter roughly every month with updates and resources and stories. So happy to share that.
Awesome. We'll make sure to get that in the notes from the meeting that gets distributed to our readership.
Thanks. And in fact, we featured a cover story about Big Hole Watershed Committee in the last one.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, that was great. And we continue, I forgot to mention that, but we continue to work on the regulatory front. We're actually actively working with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're considering a streamlined permitting approach to allow people to act like beavers in the right places. And from everything, folks that have seen us present for years now on the beaver mimicry stuff that we're doing, it's creating wetter, greener areas that stay wetter and greener longer, which is something I think everyone can get behind. So trying to make sure that we can continue doing that type of work. And I hope that all you students, Arika, thank you so much for getting everybody here and staying engaged with us. It's really awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, anytime.
Thank you.
The only other comment I might have, this is Jim Hagenbarth. I'm talking to Paul and Roy. When you were young, your dad, or if he wasn't around, your mom would take you to the beaver pond and you'd dunk a worm with the strike indicator and have a hell of a good time. It's hard to find those places anymore.
They're up No Tell 'em Creek, Jim.
We want pictures. That's great. Jim, I think that comment about the how forestry kind of ties into this work is really, really interesting. And there's a growing interest in forestry and conifer encroachment work that we're also seeing statewide. And I think those two initiatives are really kind of, they're not paralleling, they're kind of coming together in an interesting way. So I hope to stay on top of that.
Okay.
All right. Any parting thoughts, folks, or any lingering questions that people have? Well, let's get unmute yourselves and let's get a parting round of applause here for Sarah and Alyssa for their contributions today. I think that was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if anyone has questions, I'm always happy to chat beavers. So you can contact me after this meeting too.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody,
Have a good evening.
for
Thanks,
joining
guys.
us. Yep.
Thank
And
you.
Thanks,
we
everybody.
won't meet as the committee. We won't meet in December because we take December off. January is our board meeting. And so our next meeting will be in February, third Wednesday of the month. And we look forward to seeing you all there.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you,
everyone. Have a
everybody.
good one. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.